Welcome, attendees. Thank you for joining us for this panel presented by Folk Alliance International for Folk Unlocked. My name is Catalina Maria Johnson. I'm on the board of directors of FAI, very honored to be so, and also a cultural journalist, writer, radio host, and producer. So before we begin, let's take a moment to acknowledge that we are joined today by folks from all around the globe, that we are using technology that is not accessible to all, and that we recognize the importance, complexity, and difficulty of land acknowledgements in the context of online creation and collaboration and organizing you. We invite you to join in acknowledging your shared responsibility to use this time together well, and for each of us to consider our roles in reconciliation, decolonization, and active allyship. I'd also like to add, I'm tuning in from Chicago, the traditional homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi nations. Many other tribes, like the Miami, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Sac, and Fox, have also called this area home. And we are thankful that now we get to call Chicago home, thanks to their careful tending of this land. So I'm going to introduce each of our esteemed, highly esteemed panelists. And when I do, I'm going to ask each of them to please speak briefly, answering this question. It's all about interviews, and in this case, from the artist perspective. And I hope I someday get to be the answer to this question for each of you. So I'm going to start with Amy Ray. Amy, thank you for over 30 years, renowned, one half of the Grammy Award winning folk duo Indigo Girls, and so many accomplishments that you'll be able to read. Amy, your favorite interview. So what was your favorite interview and kind of why?
I've had a lot of really great interviews, so I hate to play favorites, but the one that stands out, like, I don't have to look it up and I just know it in my head, is when Krista Tippett interviewed us for a show called On Being. And Krista, the thing that made it special, I think, was it was a conversation. Also that Krista was well informed about our history and our catalog, and we didn't have a lot of general sort of basic questions. It cut right to very specific, detailed questions and allowed us to, bypass all the sort of general stuff about our history that we talk about all the time. So it was more engaging for us, really. And that made us probably better at being interviewed. And she responded as a peer, and with interest and curiosity. And I think that also helps because it livens up the interview when the person doing the interview is actually looking at you and engaged in it and not just thinking about what their next question is or how they're going to write their article. So those are the things I think made that special. And also I think it was a specific interview about music and its relationship to spirituality, and it contextualized a lot of things, which also helps focus an interview. So I think Krista Tippett On Being was my favorite one.
Wow, that's a high bar for journalists. I mean, she's spectacular, at all of that dialogue, peer quality, and definitely well informed. So to our next panelist, and this is Mama Mihirangi, and all the way from New Zealand. I've had the pleasure of actually seeing Mama Mihirangi in Montreal, and that's one of the wonderful things about FAI and Folk Unlocked, and I'm sure many of the Folk Alliance conferences you get to see artists that you really discover. So the renowned artist, activist, and Queen of Loops from New Zealand, Mihirangi, tell us a little bit more about your favorite interview and why it was one of your favorites. Without naming names, it's okay.
Tēnei te mihi tuatahi nā mihi nui kia koutou mo tō awhina, mo tō tono ki au, ki wainga nui koutou, ngā rau rangatirama. So I just want to acknowledge, I feel very honoured, especially to be here amongst what I just said in Māori, chiefs in the world of world music. So thank you so much, FAI, for having me, and Catalina. I one of my favorite interviews came about only just last year. I've like Amy, I've had, every interview is a great opportunity for us to have hopefully good publicity. But one of my favorite interviews happened last year when, actually no, before last year, because we had COVID last year. A woman, her name was Stephanie Greist, and she was writing a book called Art Above Everything, and it was about global women with a singular vision. And she's a writer professor from the University of North Carolina in the US, and she had sent me a request to do this interview, and she sent me some interviews that she had already done previously. And what she was doing was she was traveling around the world meeting these women who have basically come through adversity. She'd just done so much research and background on these other artists, and the way that she wrote wasn't just poetic, it was just so deep and meaningful and culturally sensitive. And so basically what she did was she came to Aotearoa, to New Zealand, which I just thought was an incredible thing. And she came here to interview me, and she stayed with me at my house. She traveled with me to my concerts and to rehearsals and to significant cultural places that meant a lot to me as a person. So I think even though there was a lot of, it was, the fact that she came all the way here, I think one of the big things was the reciprocity of friendship gained through that interview allowed me to feel like I could just trust her fully and open up my home to her and open up my personal life to her at such a depth. So yeah, that was one of my favorite.
Yeah. That's fascinating, because I think it speaks to, an intimacy that sometimes is hard to create in a phone call or in a video. But if you can actually go to the world, especially when you're dealing with a complex and, for many of us, very unknown, culturally unknown world, to be able to immerse yourself is quite special. And if you can't, then at least try to see the world from the other perspective.
Yeah,
sure.
And her place within it as well. It was really her place within the relationship, which was really interesting. Yeah.
Wow. Oh, I wish I could take notes and read all at the same time. This is great. So our next guest is Kamara Thomas, and a singer, songspeller, mythology fanatic. That sounds fascinating. And multidisciplinary storyteller based in Durham, North Carolina. So Kamara, from your point of view, what was the favorite interview? What was it like? What worked?
I've got kind of a short-term memory. So I will have to just pull up, the kind of most recent interviews that I just had so much fun inside of. And, I think a lot of people are coming up with these amazing podcasts that, like On Being and things like that, where you really are able to go deep. And if there's anything anybody meets about me, it's like, let's go deep right now. I don't want to talk about the surface stuff. I want to talk about art. I want to talk about like how we make art. I want to learn something about making art better. So, the two I have to do two. I'm sorry. The first one was Tamara Kassane here in Durham does this artist soapbox podcast where she really just asks artists about process. So that was a really amazing interview because she, especially as, I'm a multidisciplinary artist, as you just mentioned. And so lots of times it's easy to kind of focus on the music I'm making in interviews, it's just kind of the easy path to follow. And she really wanted to talk about, all of the different things that kind of make up the kind of circular and enmeshment of art forms that I'm involved in. And there's something about the interview that is kind of naturally therapeutic, I guess. It's like, I always, in a really good interview, I always kind of hit on something that I didn't know before because the interviewer is asking me questions that I have maybe not asked myself before or haven't tried to to crystallize or put into words before. And so, you know, I love those interviews where there's a deep conversation that happens. You know, and then the other one I would say is Reese Palmer just launched her Color Me Country podcast on Apple and interviewed me. And you know, something we talked about in that interview that you know is so important to me is that a lot of times artists of color, we kind of get railroaded into the conversation about being of color and what it's like to be Black and la 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 la, you know. And so there's kind of always that becomes part of the surface conversation for us. And so in that interview, we were able to kind of unpack that and then also talk about art, you know, really the idea that artists show up to interviews to talk about our work, and we really love to share our work and want to dive into the work and, you know, share it in this other way, which is talking about it. You know, we don't necessarily want to talk about our private lives or much of anything else in that space. And so an interviewer who sets up a space where we can just really have a deep conversation and both walk away having learned something is, I think most artists, all artists I know, we just want more experience, you know, more juice, more inspiration. So I love interviews where I walk away inspired.
That's interesting, because on the one hand, you want interviewers, one wants interviewers to be informed about who you are and your culture. But on the other hand, you don't want to stay there just all the time and never have your art treated in a larger, more extended, you know, context. So that's fascinating. Yeah. Well, our next panelist, probably doesn't need an introduction from me, but I'm just going to say a few things. It's interesting when Mihirangi said, you know, chief, I thought in Spanish, because that's where I come from, you know, jefe de jefes, or in the ladies, jefa de jefas, bosses of bosses. So Joe Henry is a singer, songwriter, recording artist, poet, author, Grammy-winning producer, and an amazing musician, artist, member of music, the American landscape, totally. So, Joe, your favorite interview and what made it work, please?
Well, thank you for your very kind words, for starters. Like Amy Ray, you know, hands down, my favorite interview experience was with Krista Tippett on Being, you know, and you know what's remarkable. I think what she does is completely anomalous as long form, in-depth interview. And when I was on her show, and I think it was in 2014, I had a new record out, but that was not the basis of our conversation. You know, she has the broad framework of talking about life through a lens of spirituality. Even if you think of yourself as a person with no grounding in spirituality, that is also worth talking about. So she begins an interview by asking you about your spiritual biography and how you understand yourself in that frame. And then conversation kind of takes off from there. And she's a remarkable research person and spends a lot of time in preparation. And I thought that she was so well versed in the work that I've tried to do that, you know, I didn't ever feel like there was something I couldn't talk about lest it become, you know, out of the sphere of her understanding. So it became, you know, the best kind of conversation. And without talking about my work, you know, only or even specifically, you know, everything we talked about sort of gestured out to my life and the work that's grown out of it. So it's a very three-dimensional experience to have a conversation like that. And I think in every interview that becomes a great one, it's when it stops becoming question and answer and it becomes conversation, and whatever notes the journalist might have arrived with or whatever agenda you as the artist might have had going into it, it all sort of falls away and conversation happens and you find out what it is that you actually have to talk about.
Wow. Yeah, just like the magic kind of happens or doesn't. But which leads me to the next question. When it doesn't happen, have you ever had an interview that, kind of was tanking? And this is for everybody, and that without naming names, it was really tanking. And then, what did the interviewer, were they able to do something that kind of like broke it open? I mean, now we have Zoom and much more video contact, but before it was phone, and and you're like, you might be in the background kind of rolling your eyes going, oh, what a waste of time. But then all of a sudden something happened. We now know what we shouldn't do, a little bit, I think, as interviewers, but any kind of like salvaging strategies that you might recommend to the person on the other side. No, I see.
Sorry, I don't know that I have any salvaging strategies. I just know that when things start to tank, I'll usually just kind of take over.
That'll work.
I'm familiar and get this information out. I'm kind of an internal optimist, I'm like, I show up like, what's going to happen,
Yeah, that's it. Any other salvaging strategies worth mentioning? Amy, you're laughing. I think you've got one.
I'm trying. I laughed when you said you kind of take over, because it's sometimes things get awkward when the person doesn't know anything about you. And so you try to, I tend to, if it's really tanking, I'll just be like, can we reschedule? Because I think like there's probably some basic stuff that I can send you that's just going to help things go better for everybody. And that's usually when it's like a high school kid, or somebody younger. And I feel, I understand what they're trying to accomplish. And I just want to be a team. If it's something where somebody I can tell just does not care at all about the interview, and it's just like an assignment and they're trying to write a preview for a show you're doing, and they're like the agricultural editor for the paper or something, which happens all the time, because people they're short-staffed, so they have to assign people to things they don't know about. It's not like a aspersion on the person. It's just like, I'll just be like really quick, short, specific answers to try to like get it going for them and be done, and that's kind of what I mean, I don't know if there's something you could do. A lot of times you can ask about something that brings you in common with each other. What's your favorite book, that you've read in the last month? Something specific, not of all time, but like, name your, if you had a day off, what are the 3 things you would really want to get done? Like just, or do for fun. I think just try to, as an interviewer, if you feel like you're losing ground, hone in on something that's really universal but specific that you can relate, because everybody doesn't want to just talk about themselves all the time. People get tired of that. They want to contextualize life, and have a conversation. And it could be, so like, I don't want to talk about being queer constantly, but I want somebody to understand that that's part of my repertoire, but at a given, but I want to have something in common with the interviewer. So if it's, try to find some common ground, if it's a white guy, straight guy, there's common ground is music. Let's talk about music, And so I think like, just try to remember that, consider the person you're interviewing and think about it. But it's, when something's tanking, it's hard sometimes, because it's not anybody's fault. It's just like a bad day,
Yeah.
So.
I mean, the reason I asked this is I specifically had an occasion to interview someone fairly famous, international, and it was, it was really tanking bad. I mean, it was like this person was like on a very, not wanting to talk. It was pulling teeth, and I was about to yank the cord, just say, well, thank you very much. And then I remembered that they had dubbed the voice of a very famous character in a very famous movie, a children's movie. And I said, well, what was it like to be, and I won't tell you because you might be able to Google that. And that was like, they were like, oh, my I took my son, and he's like, that's my dad, in the middle of the theater. Anyway, that like was, that little dumb detail, but it's hard sometimes. Yeah. So I don't know if anybody else has that. That's a very good one, the common ground. I love that though. You have to find, it's very hard. As I hear you, I mean, you're talking about that, you wish they'd hire a music person sometimes instead of the agricultural editor, and you can't get them to. And then you read what the agricultural editor wrote, and you're like, man, But then also, I think, there's so much very like rapid consumption, as you all know, and I think you're all talking about depth, which is interesting. I have another question about that. But in the meantime, anything else? Any other salvaging strategies from Mihirangi or from Joe?
Go Joe.
No, please.
I really don't do ladies before gentlemen. Can you please just go?
Well, sure I will. I mean, I was raised a Southerner. I'm trained to do it. I was just going to say that most all of us who've done interviews over a long period of time, worst case scenario, we all know how to say what we want to get said, no matter what anybody asks us. You know how to steer a conversation. I think most of us would rather not have to do that, because then it's not a conversation anymore. Someone's just holding a door, and you read your agenda into the public record. But I don't think I've had one go terribly wrong in a really long time. I mean, the only time I can think of having an interview where I, would have wanted to pull a ripcord was, as Amy was saying, when people show up to do an interview and haven't really done any, of their homework at all, and I remember when in my earliest days, it wasn't uncommon for someone to get on the phone with me and say, I really haven't had a chance to listen to your new record, so what can you tell me about it? And it took a little while before I realized I was allowed to just say, I could tell you nothing at all about it. Everything I had to say about that record is on it. And I hope you have a nice rest of your day. I don't continue conversations like that. I'm really happy to talk to just about anybody about anything, as long as people have sort of owned their responsibility for being there in the way that I try to own mine.
Wonderful. Yeah, that's it's hard. It's hard. Sometimes, things get assigned that are not in your wheelhouse. I say that, from my perspective, and you're just scrambling, and then you run across, 332 pieces of information that are almost all identical. And you're like, no, wait a minute, I want to know and something about this artist that hasn't been repeated, or isn't on the press release. But nevertheless, that's the work. That's the work that has to be done to have a real conversation. So, for sure. Okay, Mihirangi. So, your turn.
I actually had to look up the word tanking because I think it's a Northern Hemisphere thing, because and I'm sure the algorithms were out to get me. I couldn't find it anywhere. I was like, no, it doesn't mean tank. It doesn't mean this. I'm like, what does tanking mean? So I think, but once I found out, I think one of the things that really, one of the worst interviews that I ever had was really awful, was so awful. I had written a song that I was releasing in Australia, and the song specifically was about sexual abuse. But I had chosen not to use the word sexual abuse because I didn't want that part of myself to be shared so publicly. I mean, like, we didn't have the Me Too movement back then. And the song's called Slave, and the song was almost like about equality. And the guy that was interviewing me, because I was performing the song live on ABC, and the guy that was interviewing me asked me about the song. I told him about it. I said to him, I don't refer to it as a song about sexual abuse. I refer to the song as about equality and trying to find equality with the masculine and all this kind of stuff. And anyway, as he introduced me, he turns around and he says, this is a song from Mihirangi. It's called Slave, and it's a song about rape.
Oh.
And I was so so devastated that my performance was lousy because I was so shooken up that I couldn't even say anything to this guy. I was like, how dare you? And the interview just went, it just ended there for me. I wasn't going to say anything. I was so in shock that I couldn't say anything. And it just made me feel like this guy really doesn't like me. He's really out to it was just really awful, really awful.
Yeah.
As you can imagine, especially being an Indigenous woman, coming out publicly back then, this is the beginning of my career. I was super young, super sensitive. I had, and it was him taking the liberty to mince my words and to push something forward that was super private that I'd specifically asked him not to share. And that was really, now I don't care, now I can say, I feel I say whatever I want, but, back then, especially with the Me Too movement, but back then it was like, you just don't say that kind of stuff, or especially the word rape,
Yeah. It's all about, the care that you take in terms of keeping the dialogue a dialogue, like something you would never say about a friend, that if you wanted to. But there's always especially now, there's the clickbait issue. I've had that a lot with queer artists. It's like, come on, don't, and the editors will do this, they'll put a headline that I'm like, no, that's not the interview. That's not what this is about. And it's in, like you said, it's part of whatever the artist has shared with me to share, but it's not like the main point of the piece, not unless the artist specifically said, this is the main point of my work and I want this highlighted in our conversation. And many of you have talked about length. So now I'm thinking, a lot of times, especially as artists, move up in the world, you don't get a lot of, Krista can get, all she wants, maybe, but the rest of us kind of, on the lower tiers, we're told 15 minutes, 10 minutes. And I've often had, I don't know, in your publicists' cases, I've been cut off, I've been told, you're 10 minutes or you're 15 minutes, are almost up, and they're in the background listening, which I get, maybe necessary or desirable, doesn't matter to me. But the time issue is, do you feel that that a longer interview will always, not always, but isn't a part of what makes something good? Should we really fight for longer time with the artists? And how do we, well, you don't know how we get it, but do you think length is an issue? Yeah.
I don't know that length may be an issue, but I think kind of combining what you're just saying with, I'm sorry, I've been listening very carefully, but I cannot pronounce your name yet. So I'm
Mihirangi?
One more time, please.
Mihirangi.
Mihirangi.
Yeah.
Is that correct? Okay. You're saying that I think there's kind of, a deeper kind of current of exploitation, I guess, that artists kind of face in, the minute that we enter the public sphere, right? And so, the minute that any artist enters the public sphere and is subject to oh, I'm doing interviews, I'm doing this, I'm out there, there are all of these forces and temptations that we kind of have to make our way through and navigate through, that have to do with, how much someone is entitled to of our information, of our deepest thoughts, of our process, of our, of whatever it is that artists do.
All of it.
Yeah, all of it. And I think that, the culture, when you talk about clickbait, it's like the culture is used to kind of getting what they want, inquiring minds want to know. And so that's kind of infected, it's like, I can tell you're not that kind of interviewer, but I don't know that people kind of coming into the ranks of we interview people are really aware of those kind of ethics, in terms of what what is respectful for them to ask, what is a respectful conversation to have. And I mean, that kind of idea is like rife throughout the culture, like what is a civil conversation? What is a deep conversation? And kind of, I won't mention names, but there's a very popular, intellectual interviewer type, on NPR, who I'm always like, why are you asked that? You have no right to ask them that. You need to stop that right now. This is not a therapy session. You are not entitled to know their deepest thought about that or to bring up their personal life in that way. And it always surprises me in that direction. In this particular show, it never goes that direction when they're talking to a scientist or a political figure, or, but somehow artists, we're supposed to kind of just like give you the art and then also like everything that went into the making of the art, and that kind of talk requires so much trust. And I think artists kind of, especially when we're young and entering into those quadrants or whatever, we think, oh, I guess I'm supposed to give you this too. Oh, here you go. And before you know it, the world knows my business, and feels like they can bring it up anytime they want and talk to me about this really personal thing anytime you feel like it, So I think it's almost like that negative feedback loop where it's like artists start to be then like, forget it, 10 minutes. I never do an interview over 10 minutes. They can kind of create that dynamic, and it kind of washes in the good interviewers with the bad. They all kind of get thrown in the same soup,
Yeah.
If I may.
Yeah, sure, please.
I'll just say it's a good point that you made about, artists who are young and beginning. I mean, I think it's probably true for a lot of us, but I'll just speak for myself that before I was even conscious of it, I was so, hungry to get a leg up that I came to feel that whatever I was asked in an interview, I was sort of obliged to respond to. And it was a little while before I understood that I was allowed to say no, or turn the conversation, or call out something that might be inappropriate or, completely beside the point. But I think it takes a little bit of experience before we kind of know that we're allowed to give ourselves permission to, to be on equal footing. I know that when I began and I was talking to a very senior, experienced journalist, there's that sort of unspoken feeling that I had that if you don't play ball, you don't get invited back. So I think it takes us a while to, just like in any aspect of life where we really think we can take ownership of our own sensibility and our own sense of decorum and privacy. We probably all have things that have marked us early on that are default questions for journalists, either because it's the one obvious thing that they know, or it's the most sensational thing about us that they know. And then if you have 10 minutes, that is the conversation. There's the lead up to it and there's the ramp out of it, and then that's it. But I think just like in any part of our work, it's really liberating and important when we start taking ownership for what we offer up.
Wow, that's great. And that kind of is great because it's also a good segue into the other thing I was thinking about. As everybody, you've mentioned now artists at different parts of their development and their, as their role grows in the music industry, have different, learn different things and are able to certainly present themselves perhaps more to their liking. So what do you think, what is, from your perspective and maybe at different stages, what is the value of an interview? This is kind of advice for other artists, because it's my understanding it's not just interviewers, but artists in the audience. So why do interviews? I mean, what, and maybe that will change as Joe was mentioning, there might be changes along the way in terms of moving through a maturity in the music industry, but why do them at all? What can artists gain from them? What would you tell artists in terms of their advices as to why why participate in this and these dialogues? Of course, if Krista invites you to do anything, always do it. But I mean,
I can say that, on a practical level, you want to get the news out about a show that you have or a record that's come out or a performance or whatever your art is, that's how people find out about it. And it's a kind of a thing. It's an agreement, that you want to be a team player with your label or with yourself or with the publications that support you and the podcasts and the shows that support you. And so it's just part of that thing. And you just have to decide, like, what do you want it just to be like the me show, or do you want this to achieve something more, which is bring people in and have them engaged and to think about themselves a little bit more and what their place is in the world, and for me as an activist, bring attention to issues that I might be working on, whether it be environmental or queer or indigenous issues or issues in racism, like whatever issue we're working on. A lot of times I pointedly want to do an interview to illuminate or amplify somebody's voice who's doing work in this arena. So that's the point of the interview, and I make it really clear. And if that's what the writer wants to do, the journalist wants to do, that's awesome, And so there's different kinds of interviews. There's interviews that are informative about a show that you're doing, which can be like 10 minutes long. There's an interview that's more of a contextualized thing about your life, which can be 45 minutes long. And then there's the ones that are about activism that should also be long. And I think you have to know what it is you're trying to achieve and what the writer is trying to achieve as well, or the podcaster, or the radio or TV person. So I think there's a lot that you need to think about as an artist so that you're also prepared, because it isn't appropriate to tell a writer who's doing an in-depth profile that you have 15 minutes. That's ridiculous. You can't do it in 15 minutes. Give them 30, but if it's a preview for a show coming up and it's really just like, what's your favorite food and your favorite color and what do you do when you're in town? That's a 10-minute interview, and it shouldn't be any longer than that. And if it is, it's not, no one's gaining from that. So that's kind of, I guess that's like the team player in me trying to like make sure everybody's thinking about what their job is at the moment, or their mission, I should say.
I love that. I haven't not heard that expressed, to think of the interviewer, interviewee as a team with a common purpose, hopefully, of sharing the artist's vision and sharing the artist's vision at that very point in time. Like you said, whether the vision is to play the show that next day or the vision is to share the, an activist world and call attention to a much larger cause, and then work together to make that happen. And so to perceive it not as entirely separate roles, but as two, complementary roles within a team with the same mission.
And I'll just add to that but there's one other thing, which is like, I find that when we do interviews in Europe or the UK, for instance, it's always super provocative. That's important too. Like, it's always super challenging. When I was young, it used to piss me off because I was like, why are you taking me to task for being from Georgia? That's so racist, or, whatever. It's like, instead now I listen to them and I think, I appreciate this challenge. Now I'm going to come to you with an equally provocative statement that you don't actually know what you're talking about, because there's a lot of great activists here, and I live in the home of John Lewis, like something like that, where yes, there is racism. Yes, there is this in Atlanta, but we also have Stacey Abrams, and like, can you focus on the positive things so we can try to make a
yay, Georgia.
I know, right?
On the positive things. Yay, thank you.
Sorry for talking. I that's too long of an answer, but that's
no, it's fascinating. So some more insights into why artists should do interviews. What I know it seems like a simple question, but I'm curious. Yeah.
I think one of the things, I totally agree with everything that Amy said. I mean, for me as an artist, I'm always wanting to be interviewed purely based on what it is that I'm writing about and the activism. I've always been, I don't know, I'm just so passionate about the stuff that's going on, especially as equality for, Indigenous being Indigenous and people being Indigenous and, you know, even white people being Indigenous. And, you know, there's this whole, like, you know, I'm always pushing for those things. But one thing that I always have to remember, especially as an artist, and I say this to any young artist coming up through the ranks, is that you really, like, when you got to remember that who you're talking to, and who, it's not the interviewer that you're talking to, it's the person who's either reading, listening, or watching. And that's a really personal experience for the reader, the listener, and the person, you know, receiving information about you. And I like to always remind myself that when I go into these interviews, that I'm speaking to that person personally, directly. I'm not speaking to, and if a magazine contacts me and says, "Oh, what's your favorite food? What's your favorite color? What's your favorite blah blah blah?" I don't really, none of that interests me. It doesn't interest me because essentially they're asking me to speak to the masses, basically. They're not actually asking me to speak to someone specifically who reads their magazine, who watches their show. And I always say, especially to my publicist, I'll say, can you please give me some background on the interviewer? Can you give me some background on their magazine? And therefore, I can really know who their audience is and who I'm speaking to and why I'm speaking to those people. And I try and get as personal as I can for those people out of respect for them wanting to read about me, you know?
That's fascinating because in radio you always say don't speak to a group of people. Speak to one person when you're doing a radio show. Speak to one person, whoever that's the person you're speaking to. So that's kind of interesting that also plays out on the other side, of being interviewed as an artist.
That's a really good point, because when we're talking to anybody, when an interview becomes conversation, like we were saying earlier, we want to be having a conversation in the spirit of one-on-one, but we're always aware and need to be that interviewer for us is a portal to a wider group of people. So I think we have to really maintain that balance of an intimate, real-time engagement with a person who is, hopefully brought a lot of care and purposeful thought to the table. But at the same time, they are funneling out, into a broader world. And we have to somehow, keep a foot in both streams where we are intimate and engaged, but we know that we're not pretending not to know that we're speaking to a larger group of people.
Yeah.
I would say too, just to speak to maybe the necessary selfishness of an artist too, that in order to kind of maintain integrity, right? Of just saying, I try to remind myself before every interview, like, this is what I came to do. This is where I stand on things. This is what's important to me. This is, and so it helps in that decision-making process, right? Because is the interview there to just to get some exposure, some quick exposure? Sometimes I'm in a place where, I just need some quick exposure. This is great. But other times, just doing a lot of quick exposure waters down what I'm doing, waters down the place I stand. And so always trying to contextualize it for myself of is this interview moving me in the direction that I want to go as an artist? Because, I want to be as potent as I possibly can be out there. I don't want, and especially in this kind of this new, not so new anymore, but
unfortunately,
how it's so attention is sparse. So if I get your attention, I don't want it to be, hello, my bag, like I want I want your attention, and when I get it, I want to make sure that you walk away knowing what I came to do, and if if my art is something that can move you, so, I think, in that way, it's kind of like keeping our feet on the ground and being really grounded and anchored in who we are as artists. And then, looking at the kind of constellation of possible interviews and saying, these are the ones that are gonna take me where I'm trying to go.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, that brings me to one of the, perhaps the last question, we'll see, but we're running out of time. It always seems like it's, an hour is a long time, but not really. But which brings me to these times. I mean, here we are in very, very complicated times, living through them so far, with great losses for many of us. Has the interview process changed for you at all in these times, on any level, whether, or but more like the value and the intentionality, which I'm hearing, it's such a beautiful thing, like there's an intentionality, there's something I'd like to share. Have there been changes as a result of these very complicated times in the interview process, on any level for you?
Well, I would think they've become a bit higher value in that our access to each other seems to be so much more limited in this moment. So, anything that's a portal to us being in communion with each other, that's high currency. And in moments where we are so often isolated from each other, those moments we have, like this, for example, when we have a chance to be connected in real time, I found it to be profound and particularly potent. And because it's, a lot of us, most of us, all of us can't be out in the world the way that we might be and have come accustomed to be. And, where an interview situation might have been tangential in some ways in the past, they might sort of be everything right now in terms of how we are able to radiate any thought out to a group of people, in real time. So, I think that, that certainly changed,
Yeah, somebody, well, that's interesting, because I was just reading something about, in these times, it's so important to resist the forced disconnection, which is, it's been forced on us. It's not, we would not have chosen it, but to resist it and to acknowledge that Zoom is another space, or StreamYard, or whatever, is being used, is another space in which to connect. It with all of its limitations, with all of its whatever's, and we're sick of it. Yes. But it is another space, and it can be a space for connection. So I'm curious, any other thoughts, as to a change in the value, or your perspective on interviews, in these times?
I mean, I would just say that, like, it's such a hard, tragic time for so many people, and there's just so much that's so intense that you're talking to someone, and there's this humanity to it that is just like crazy to me, that it's so beautiful. And so many people have that vulnerability right now, that even the hardest, most objective interviewer, you can feel them in their world, like, just that it's just so hard right now for people to tackle everything, the suffering in the world, and the problems with inequality. And it's just like the most hard-hearted people get it, and I feel like these interviews now are like, I don't know if I'm just like vulnerable because of I'm at home and there's so much going on in the world and it's so incredible, but I feel this humanity happening that I wasn't feeling all the time necessarily. So it's a beautiful thing. It's hard that it had to happen because of a pandemic. I wish we could be human in other times, but I definitely find that, and also you're talking to someone over Zoom in their bedroom and you see their cat walk through, and when I'm watching PBS NewsHour and I see Lisa Desjardins' cat in the background, I'm like, oh, she's a human just like the rest of us. It's very leveling in some way. That's killer. I like that.
Wow. Yeah. It's interesting.
Well,
It's something to keep in mind for the future. It's like, don't forget that just because, we hope to be back in better times. Don't forget that human connection is still there and is possible. So, Joe, I'm sorry I interrupted.
no, I just was wanted to underscore what Amy was saying about, how in every moment of adversity, there's something invitational there as well, and we all know what the downside of this particular era of COVID has been, but it's really easy to lose sight of what, where's the invitation in it? What is it inviting? Where else? How else might we walk? And I just, Amy, I appreciate you flagging that.
I would also add that some of the most rewarding creative instincts come from limitation, from the things that you have to let go of and shave off, and even having to work within this screen, trying to see what the possibilities are for that. And really, I think I've been seeing that there's still kind of a limitlessness to the ideas that can get poured into this limitless space, into this limited space, or this this restricted space. Ideas are still kind of infinite.
Much bigger, always. That's wonderful. Wow. I don't know if any, that I'm just kind of lost in a reverie because this has been like such a beautiful conversation on so many levels. And I
Yeah.
love that. I love that idea of, I've tried to really keep that in mind. What is it? Pandemic gifts, unwanted, maybe, in a sense, certainly not in the context, but they're still gifts there. And some of it is this kind of a very different understanding. I think many of us already had a connection, kind of a global, we're in it together, we are one. But boy, this brought that home. Totally. It made it clear. If you didn't have it clear, well, it still hasn't made it clear to some people, unfortunately. But to those of us that were already kind of thinking in that direction, it did. And it's been beautiful and terrifying all at the same time. So we have I've gotten a sign that it's like the 5 minutes, time sign. So if you have some final thoughts about interviews, about these times, about anything you'd like to share, we don't even have to stay to the topic. If you have a few thoughts to share in the context of our conversation, I would love to hear them.
I think one of the things that Amy spoke to in the previous question about vulnerability, and we talked about clickbait, and it's that thing about integrity and authenticity, the balance of all of that stuff. And now with interviews, people can come into your homes and into your personal space, and they really get a sense of, your music is your own personal portal for you to share stuff in a very specific way, or even not in a specific way. But when you get into these interviews, into your homes, there's, especially when it comes to the live stuff, when you're doing a live interview online, and, I don't know, there's just we're saturated. The market is now saturated with live streaming, with, all online content, that you've got to be really super clear that you're not doing anything just for clickbait because we're trying to gain attention for ourselves because we can't tour, or, all of that kind of stuff, and stay to that authenticity, but with integrity. And I think that's really, really important. But it's really hard to, I don't know, for myself, we're stuck in New Zealand. We're very, very lucky here.
We
have no COVID
Yep.
cases. We're like, oh my gosh, we have, but there's this real sense of separation of, just being locked up in these spaces. And for me, there's a sense of sadness about that. And I can't help but in an interview, or any interview, or, or even an online performance, that that there's still this like, I can't touch you, I can't feel you, I can't reach you, I can't, so yeah, just being really clear and conscious about that stuff, and maintaining authenticity in this space is, it's very different.
It is, but it's kind of still possible, to reach out and touch,
Yeah.
which is always like the beauty of it, right? Yeah. Ooh, reach out and touch. We're here. Any other thoughts on interviews and these times, on anything?
I just want to say it's nice to meet y'all, Kamara and Mihirangi. I haven't met y'all before, so it's really wonderful. And Catalina, it's great to meet y'all.
Yeah, thank you.
It really is. This has been thought provoking for me. And Joe, I always love hearing what you have to say.
No, you're very kind. Thank you.
I do. I really do. I love the way your brain works. It's awesome.
I love the way everybody's brain works here in this group. It's like a very, it's a very much of a bigger picture brain.
Yeah.
Trust fund here.
Really
nobody's stuck to the little nitty, piddly stuff. Everybody went pithy, went big right away. I love that. Thank you so much for this conversation. And so thank you to each of you, to Joe, to Mihirangi, to Amy, to Kamara. Thank you. And
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, awesome. And
I really do hope that I get to see you guys at FAI again one day soon. I get to give you guys a big hug. I just want to squeeze you guys. I hope you can feel that.
Looking forward to the day.
we will. I'll look you all up for a group hug at the next FAI. But in the meantime, and so I would just want to let those watching know that the session will continue to be available as a recording on the Folk Unlocked platform all week. So, and also please take a moment to provide some feedback about today's conversation, post comments in the chat. And I have another, also, of course, Folk Unlocked is made available at a pay what you can price point, thanks to the generosity of donors. So if you would like to support our work more directly, donations can be made at folk.org/donate. So stay safe, stay connected, community. See you soon. Hasta la próxima. Take care. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.